Hello and welcome to Larry Talks. I'm your host, Dr. Larry Dean Doyle, and I'm really happy you're here. Whether you're listening during your commute, a quiet moment at home, or somewhere in between, thank you for choosing to spend this time with me. So take a breath, get comfortable, and let's get into today's session. Tonight I want to talk you through something that sounds complicated at first, but once you hear it in plain English, you'll understand exactly why it matters and why the public deserves better. Let's start with something simple. When the federal government spends money, every payment is supposed to have a tracking number. It's called a PIID, a Procurement Instrument Identifier. Think of it like a tracking number on a package. If you order something online, you can see where it came from, where it's going, and what's inside. Government payments work the same way, or at least they're supposed to. But here's what I found. Between 2010 and 2012, federal agencies sent over $20 million to Monsanto. And in many cases, the government's own tracking system cannot tell us what the money was for. Not won't tell us, can't tell us, because the tracking numbers are missing, wrong, replaced with 4-digit placeholders, or pointing to the wrong dollar amounts. Let me give you an example. There's a $4 million payment. It has a tracking number. You type that number into the system and it brings up a $1 million payment instead. Imagine ordering a $4,000 TV and the tracking number tells you that it was a $1,000 toaster. That's what's happening here. But if you search by the vendor name, Monsanto, suddenly the real $4 million payment appears, and it's mislabeled under a company name that didn't even own Monsanto at the time. That's not a typo. That's not a clerical error. That is a system designed in a way that allows certain payments to slip through without a paper trail. And here's why that matters. If the government can spend millions of dollars without a clear record of what the money was for, then the public has no way to hold anyone accountable. Not Congress, not veterans, not taxpayers, no one. This isn't about politics. This isn't about speculation. This is about basic accountability. Now let me connect this to something just as important. How agency uses a Federal Information Act. FOIA was written to give the public access to government records within 20 working days. That's the law. That's the promise. That is the deal. But here's what actually happens. When you ask for something sensitive, like herbicide records from Kadena Air Base, the agency doesn't deny it outright. They don't say the documents don't exist. They don't say the records were destroyed. Instead, they send you something that looks harmless on the surface. We need clarification. That sounds reasonable. It sounds procedural. It sounds like they're trying to help. But it's not. It's a stall tactic. Because the moment they send that clarification request, the 20-day clock stops. And it doesn't start again until you respond. And once you respond, they can send another clarification request, and another, and another. You end up in a loop that can last months, years, or in some cases, like mine, half a decade. And here's the part the public needs to understand. Agencies don't ask for clarification because they're confused. They ask for clarification because the request is clear. The records are sensitive. So instead of complying with the law, they use the process itself as a shield. They turn FOIA, a transparency tool, into a delay engine. And after 5 years of delays, most people give up. That's the point. That's the design. A system that takes 20 days to release harmless records and 5 years to release herbicide records is telling you exactly which records matter. The delay is the signal. The clarification request is a signal. The silence is a signal. And when you put that next to the payment anomalies, the missing PIIDs, the wrong dollar amounts, the mislabeled vendors, you start to see the same pattern. A government that knows certain truths exist but has built systems that make those truths almost impossible to reach. Now, before we close tonight, I want to share something that took me years to fully understand, and once you see it, you can't unsee it. I'm in possession of an internal Air Force memo written during the period when the UC-123 aircraft, the same aircraft used in herbicide operations, were being evaluated for disposal. And the memo contains a line that tells you everything you need to know about why those planes were destroyed. The recommendation reads, "I recommend, all in caps, no additional sampling." And then, in the very same document, the author lays out what the public and the press are to be told: that the aircraft were tested, that a representative number were sampled, and that only negligible levels of contamination could be detected. That's the public story. But here's the truth. Years later, the National Academy of Sciences conducted an independent study, a real scientific review, and their findings were the opposite. They found that the aircraft were heavily contaminated, that the residues were persistent, and that the exposure risk to air crews was real, not hypothetical, not theoretical, real. Now, let me explain something the public has never been told clearly. That memo didn't just mislead the public. It violated a federal court order, MDL 381. MDL 381 required the government to preserve all herbicide-related records, notify the court of any new information, and ensure that no evidence relevant to exposure was destroyed, altered, or withheld. So when an official wrote no additional sampling, they weren't just shutting down science. They weren't just shutting down evidence. They were stopping the creation of records that MDL 381 required them to preserve. And when the aircraft were destroyed without proper sampling, the government didn't just lose data. They eliminated physical evidence that the court had ordered them to protect. That's not a paperwork issue. That's not a misunderstanding. That's a direct violation of a federal preservation order. And the result? The result is the world we live in today. Veterans told there's no evidence. Agencies claiming records don't exist. FOIA offices insisting we need clarification. And a narrative built on the absence of evidence, an absence the government itself created. Because once an institution commits to a story, especially one crafted to reassure the public, it becomes very hard for that institution to walk it back. Not because the truth isn't available, but because the truth contradicts the narrative that they've relied on for decades. And that's why we're here. Not to point fingers, not to assign motives, but to show the public the difference between what was said and what the evidence actually shows. Because when you see the memo, when you see the Academy's findings, when you see the payment anomalies, and when you see the FOIA delays, and when you understand how MDL 381 was violated, you start to see the same pattern, a system that became more invested in protecting the narrative than in confronting the truth. But the truth doesn't disappear just because someone stops sampling. The truth doesn't vanish because a memo says it should. And the truth doesn't die because an institution repeats a line often enough. The truth waits, and eventually someone finds it. Tonight, that someone is you, the listener. Every time you share this podcast, every time you talk about it with a friend, every time another veteran or family member hears the truth, the silence breaks a little more. And when enough people know the truth, institutions don't get to hide behind silence anymore. They have to answer. Thank you for listening. Thank you for caring. And thank you for refusing to let the truth fade into the dark. As I wrap up today's episode, I hope it gave you something to think about, and maybe even something to carry with you and think about. If this session resonated with you, please feel free to share it with a veteran or a dependent, who is suffering, or someone that might need to hear it, or someone who may be interested in this topic. And don't forget to click on follow so that you don't miss future episodes and sessions.